Well, thanks for tuning in for another session of Back Porch Catechetics, reviewing Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraphs 2528 through 2533. The Ninth Commandment: You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. It's quite apparent that we're making a shift when we get to Commandments 9 and 10. And so you see the in brief section already connects Commandment 9, you shall not covet, desire your neighbor's wife, with Jesus' words from Matthew's Gospel. Everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I think in order to get at the bottom of what's really going on, at least on the first round read of the Ten Commandments, we have to see this transition that's going on from the outer to the inner when we move to the 9th and 10th commandment. Now, just a little technical note on versions of the commandments. In some formulations, the 9th and the 10th commandments are elided together, and there's a prohibition against coveting your neighbor's property or your neighbor's wife. It is almost as if the wife was thought of as property. Now, there's a lot to be said about that and to think through what's going on in different versions of the commandments. What's important here is that the traditional Christian catechetical vision of the commandments separates the 9th and the 10th, so that there's, not coveting another person within the bounds of marriage and not coveting the property of another person. And that very much distinguishes this understanding of marriage, from one person, particularly the man, owning another person, particularly the woman. All right, so technical note aside, we're looking at the traditional formulation for Christians in reflecting on the Decalogue. And, well, we know the first 3 commandments are effectively about loving God, and the remaining 7 are about loving your neighbor. We know that honor your father and mother can be associated with the first 3 because they're positive commandments. Do this. And then the remaining 6 are do not do this. And we know that the family, structure of the father and mother as a kind of mediator of love of God to love of neighbor is important in there. We see the perspective of the child: don't kill, do not commit violence, growing into, full adult, not committing adultery. And so there's these 3 kind of fit together, 4, 5, and 6. And then, do not steal. That's in general how to treat others around you. Do not bear false witness. That's also about treating others around you. But these things, you should not bear false witness, you should not steal, you should not commit adultery, you should not kill. These are all things which can be observed by a third person. You can just sort of objectively watch and see whether someone else is killing or stealing or lying or committing adultery. I'm not suggesting you watch these things. I'm just saying you could from the outside. Whereas, it's not clear that you could look at another person from the outside and say, oh, he's coveting his neighbor's wife or he's coveting his neighbor's goods. And so there's a shift from external forum to internal forum here. And that shift is quite important. Well, let's think about how we normally draw that out. If we're thinking of just a basic sense of the human person or human virtue, and this will let us get to kind of what Jesus is talking about, I think. We've thought of the human person and like a goal for some kind of action. And we've said multiple times before, there's some thinking that's involved. And there's some choice which is involved. And these are sort of internal processes, and you have to agree to it, you have to think about it, decide it's good, you have to choose it, want it's good, cling to it, love it in that sense. But what's the it? Well, the it is, some kind of impulse, some kind of desire. And those impulses can come from within you. They could also come from outside of you. And it's like, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness. That's the action already happened. And anybody else could see whether that's happened. But Commandments 9 and 10, you shall not covet. These are really sort of the internal states. These would be the internal impulses. And perhaps it could come from external stimuli. I mean, looking at someone inappropriately or someone else doing something inappropriately could be a kind of temptation to you. So there could be a sense of coveting which comes from the external world or the internal world. These impulses arise, and the commandment says don't do that. Now this raises a question: are we in control of these things? That's a question that perhaps we should frame out on the side. I think we are, and I think it's in the mind of the Ten Commandments, but I realize it's not explicit in this transition from the kind of external to the internals in the Decalogue. So, well, what's the traditional answer to this problem? Are we in control of these things, or what would it mean not to covet? Well, part of what it means is, if we've thought about, don't commit adultery in this case, that would be the sin where the coveting your neighbor's wife, would be the kind of internal. What we're saying about don't commit adultery is like, well, don't do it. That's the earlier commandment to which the 9th is connected. Don't choose it. And well, perhaps if all we had was the 6th commandment, there would be something like, well, think about it. That's fine, but don't actually do it, right? Like look, but don't touch, as people sometimes say. But that's clearly not enough for this commandment. Now, we realize adultery, you might back it up and say, well, don't think about it, and don't choose it. Don't dwell on it, and don't choose it. And when we start to move back down this process of kind of analyzing a human action, well, before long, we're going to get to the very root of it. Don't desire it. Don't covet it. Don't dwell on it internally. And so the 9th commandment tells us that we're right to read the adult commandment to include all those other things, which, maybe have more to do with thinking about it. Okay, so we had fornication. That certainly is external. Other people can see it. But, think about masturbation. A lot of times people think, well, nobody else knows I'm doing it, right? And so what's so wrong with it? And I think there are reasons to link adultery and masturbation. They're traditional reasons, they transgress marriage. But I can see that you might say, well, it's kind of in private, who's it hurting? But then the 9th commandment says, don't even think about it, right? Don't even covet it, don't desire it. And similarly, we can get to pornography in here. And well, that would also be something like, well, who else knows? And it's consenting that people had pictures taken or whatever, and it's consenting that I look at this. But the 9th commandment is saying, no, don't desire it. Don't go down that road. We might even put this more generally, as Jesus does, anyone who looks with lust. Now, what is it that looking lustfully is doing? Well, looking lustfully is to look at another person. But it's to think of that other person, not just as, well, definitely not as a person, but it's to look at that person only as an object, right? And so it's just to see this other person in my mind as an object, particularly an object of pleasure for me. And that's what it is to look lustfully. Now, the other person may not know this. They need not know this. What this is saying is that when you look at another person in a lustful way, in a way which says you are an object for my pleasure, you've already begun to do something that's unhealthy, that leads to problems. And what is that? Well, we know that this other person is an object. I mean, in the sense that I'm seeing a person, they're the object of my sight, maybe the object of my affection, but this other person is also a subject. And so when I'm thinking of another person in that way, I'm not even thinking of that other person in her fullness, right? I'm treating her as less than what she is. So to look lustfully is actually not to see clearly. The 9th commandment, which is do not covet someone else, do not think of your neighbor's wife as an object simply of pleasure for you, is saying, do not think of the people around you as less than what they are, as less than human, because that's actually false. They're more than simple objects. All right, so on the one hand, we've got the kind of analysis of why we wouldn't covet backing up from the sixth commandment. Don't do this thing externally. How can I not do this thing externally? Well, I could choose not to do it. I mean, maybe I want it and think about it and follow along with it. Okay, well, then I want to back it up another step and say, okay, just don't even think about it, right? And then if you don't think about it, or if you always think that's bad, avoid it, then you'll never be tempted to choose it. You'll never do it. And then it's like, well, if I'm not going to think about it, don't even have an impulse to do it. Okay, but maybe I cannot control those impulses. So where does that lead us? Well, we've got another analysis of what it means to look lustfully, and that's to say that looking lustfully is itself not viewing fully. It's not seeing fully, right? It's not just that, hey, this might lead to a transgression of the law, but it's like, look, you're looking at another person, but you're only seeing part of her. You're only seeing her as an object and not also as a subject. And so the antidote for looking lustfully is to recognize another person as a person. Now, the language here is technical, but I'll encourage you to look at something like Pope Benedict. And he's got this encyclical letter, God is Love. And C.S. Lewis also articulates this in the Four Loves. And the antidote to lust is actually eros, is the erotic. Now, this is not the erotic in the sense that we sometimes use it, but the erotic is what sees another person as a person and says, oh, I want the whole person, not just a part of the person, or also not just that I want you for me, but like you're the only one that will do. So it's not just that I want some pleasure you can give me, but I actually want you as a person. So the erotic gaze is focused, and only this one will do, as opposed to the lustful look says essentially anyone will do, anyone which can bring me that pleasure. Okay, well, the Catechism puts this in terms of chastity. And chastity is really a virtue of integrating the whole person, integrating your thoughts, your choices, and your desires. Well, before we close the short review of the in brief section, let's talk about answering that question of, can I change my desires? The theology of virtue says yes, and it says yes because it turns out that when you choose well, even if it's only a tiny choice, when you think well, then that action actually returns to you and reshapes you. That is, each one of your actions forms you and puts you in a habit. And the more you do this, even when it's small choices or small things at the beginning, the bigger they become, the easier they become. And all of a sudden, this coveting, this desire gets transformed, and you get the virtue of choosing well, of thinking well, a disposition to dwell upon, to think upon, and to do the good. And you begin to see other people fully. You no longer look lustfully, only partially through these sort of concupiscence-colored glasses, but rather you see clearly, and you see other people for who they truly are. That's the antidote to looking lustfully. This is what the ninth commandment is proposing as a way of human integration, or the fullness of human action. Do not covet. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. Be sure to look at other people fully as humans, appropriately in the fullness of their sexuality, their capacity to give and receive. That seems to be difficult at first, but we realize the more we do it, the more that heals us. And of course, in our theology of virtue, we also have an understanding of grace with which we cooperate, which of course helps fulfill the law. And this is why the 9th and 10th commandments are often taken to point directly to the gospel. Jesus repeats them in many ways in shorter formulations. You've heard it said not to commit adultery, but I tell you, not even to look lustfully. It's Christ's grace which fulfills the law and makes this life of love possible.